There's 7 people out there, so people are coming in. And we're live right now. Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick, one of the organizers here at the Global Exchange Through the Pandemic and Beyond conference. It is my pleasure to present Justin Harford from Mobility International USA. Justin's been a project coordinator for 4 years at the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, which is a project sponsored by the U.S. Department of State and implemented by Mobility International. He advises people with disabilities how to participate in global exchange and program providers how to support disabled participants. He's going to talk about the opportunities to create access to exchange during and after the pandemic. And just a couple of things. First of all, we're all so happy that you're out there in the audience. Please type things in the chat to communicate with Justin, and he'll answer your questions as we're moving through. It's a great way to keep that dialogue going. And the other thing is that pinned to the top of the stage chat, take a look at it now, you'll see a link to our captioning service. And that captioning helps people who are hard of hearing access this event. But also if you're a Spanish speaker, or if you like to you like to read along with when you see the read along while you're listening to the event, you can do that too. Or if you speak any other language and your English is a little bit limited, that can help as well. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Justin. Justin, go ahead.
Thanks, Patrick. So I'm going to start, but I'm also going to start with a question, and I just kind of want to know who is here. So if you can, as I'm talking, maybe go ahead and type something in the chat box about yourself, maybe your name, where you're from, and what your goal is with Global Exchange, whether it's I want to bring more international students to study in the United States, or I want to enable more students from low-income backgrounds to study abroad, or I want to enable more students from Africa or professionals from Africa to access international opportunities, whatever the case may be. So your name, where you're from, and what your goal is in international exchange. And so then I'm going to just go ahead then and while you're doing that, because there's a 20-second delay, I'm going to go ahead and just start introducing myself, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I'm kind of going to tell you what my presentation is going to be about. So as Patrick mentioned, my name is Justin Harford, and I'm the project coordinator at the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange. I also have congenital glaucoma, which means that I'm totally blind in my left eye, and I have almost zero peripheral vision in my right eye and very little in the way of central vision in my right eye. And so essentially I am about as blind as you can get. Stereotypically, I use a cane, I read Braille. I also am using a screen reader right now to act.
Hey, everybody, it looks like Justin froze up a little bit. He'll come back. This happens. This is our new reality. This is when people clear their throat in a virtual way. Since you're hearing me right now, and I'm seeing a couple of people mention, Estefania says she's here to learn new things. Rachel is here to support more students from the US to study abroad across the globe. So please go ahead and add more things about why, for the rest of you who are here, what is it that you want to know from Justin? Why are you at this conference, and why are you at this particular session? And as I'm sitting here, I still see that Justin's screen is frozen. Well, you know, that's what happens. There's no way I can do justice to what Justin will have to offer in terms of his experience. But I will mention a couple of things that he's just popped away, so that means he'll be popping back in just a second. But I met Justin through a conference that Mobility International did just a little bit ago. Called Joining Hands. That was it's sponsored by the National Clearinghouse as well as Mobility International. Thanks, Romina. Justin did a 1-year exchange in Chile, and so you're going to hear about that a little bit more in a minute. He should be popping back in just a second. The Joining Hands conference was really great, and it helped inspire me to think about something that that we need to do. All of us really. When I was talking to the the executive director, Stu Segal from Mobility International, she said, look, now that we have to do everything different, let's just do it better. And I really liked that. And so that inspired me to move in this direction here. Doug, thanks for your comment. This is taking a little longer than I had hoped. So I'm gonna do a little pause, and please hang out for just a couple of minutes, and we'll be back on as soon as we know what's happening. Thank you. Please stand by, folks. We'll be back to the programming in just a second. And Justin's telling me he's getting closer to a router and he'll be here in just a second. Please hang on, and we're just a few minutes into this part of the session. So, here he comes, here he comes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're on, Justin, go ahead. You were just talking about using a screen reader.
Okay. So I had my first experience with international exchange actually when I was in college, and I studied abroad in Santiago, Chile for a whole academic year. And that was an extremely formative experience, both for me as a professional and somebody who was at that time interested in taking the academic path in Latin American history. I conducted my own original primary source project where, using over 500 pages of Spanish language sources, I pieced together a history of the blind in Latin Americans in Santiago, Chile during the 1920s up to the 1950s. My experience was so formative that I wanted to help other people with disabilities study abroad and also volunteer abroad. And so after a couple years working at a rural nonprofit in a different field, I found a job at Mobility International, and that's where I'm at now today. I've talked about my story. My thesis of this, I'm basically, through this talk, if I have time, and Patrick, you can let me know on time checks. My goal is to talk about, to consider what are some of the advantages that the pandemic brings us in creating access to international exchange, and particularly for people with disabilities of all kinds. Then I'm going to consider not only opportunities within the context of the pandemic, but also, fortunately, after the pandemic. It would be terribly sad if I wasn't able to think about ways that we can create access when the pandemic is over, because that would basically mean the pandemic isn't going to be over, and I think we think it's going to be over within a year or so. And after that, I'm going to consider more broadly how we advocate for openness, and in this world where a handful of countries, or maybe it's just one country, are changing their view about welcoming international students to study. And I'm going to consider how disability can be a way that we can break through some of those, some of the nationalism, and we can maybe use disability discourses to advocate for greater openness. Now, and I'm going to shortly ask you how many people, so I'm going to ask you a trivia question. Approximately, out of the whole population of the world, what percentage of that population do you think are people with disabilities? And so, and while you're at that, I'm going to make a note about disability language. It seems like one of the most common questions we get, which doesn't seem, I don't think it's really the most important question, but people worry a lot about it, has to do with language. And so I'll briefly say that there's two ways of talking about disability. There's identity first language, which is to say I'm a blind person or I'm a UC Berkeley graduate. And then there is person first language, which is to say I am a person who is blind or I am a person who graduated from UC Berkeley. The advantage of the first one is that it puts the person before the disability and sort of simply states what they have rather than what they are, while the second one, people think of it as sort of owning your identity and showing pride in your identity. But for what you can basically keep in mind is that for most professionals, it's okay if you just use person first language, i.e. by saying person with a disability. Throughout my talk, I'll basically I'll go back and forth. I'll say disabled people and people with disabilities, mostly because I think both points of view have their merits. And also, I think that it creates more lexical variation too. So,
and Justin, sorry to interrupt. You do have questions too, so just whenever you want them, let me know. Everybody, please go on. Thank you.
Great. And yeah, I think the intent is to take on questions at the end. But Patrick, let me know when it's 35 after.
You got it.
So I can wrap it up and we can get to those questions. So how many people with disabilities are in the world? What answers do we have, Patrick?
We have Estefania says 20%. Santiago says 43%. Wendy says 10%. And Rachel says 47%.
Okay, so wow, all across the board. Thanks for that. So yeah, actually there are around 15 to 20% of the world are people with disabilities. And kind of how you count that sort of can depend on how you define disability. And this reminds a story. I gave a workshop a while back at the University of Guadalajara, and I asked the person how many people with disabilities they had on their campus that they were serving. And she told me they had about 5. And this absolutely surprised me because I know that at any given university in the United States where you have 20,000 or more students, the disability office is serving probably between 1,000 and 3,000 students, just students with disabilities. But part of what's happened in the United States is that we define disability very broadly as being an impairment, medical impairment that substantially limits one or more of daily life activities. And it could be also somebody who is regarded as having such an impairment or somebody who has a history of such an impairment. And in 2008, they even expanded that to include people with a variety of learning disabilities and chronic health conditions as well. And also, so as a result, colleges over the last 20 years have seen their numbers skyrocket in terms of students that they serve. So generally now the consensus, if you consider all of those groups, not just people with visible disabilities like sensory blindness, deaf, people who can't walk, but if you consider the whole range, you actually end up with quite significant numbers. So let's consider now some of the advantages let's consider kind of some of the benefits that the pandemic can create for us. And as I talk about this, I'm mostly going to focus on virtual exchange and the advantages that virtual exchange environments create in generating access for more people with disabilities to participate. I pretty much am figuring that we're not really meeting in person. And it's all about the virtual environments. So to start with, what I have found is that virtual environments for me, and the other thing is I'm also going to give examples from work as well as from exchange programs, since we're also kind of learning a lot about this, and the range of exchange programs out there is not as, there aren't as many of them as we would hope to have quite at this point. So first of all, I think one of the things that I have personally found in my job is that virtual exchange or virtual environments can absolutely change the way that I interact with my coworkers. see. So, for example, at my work, when for example, when I collaborate with my supervisor, we'll be able to meet together over Zoom. We have a Google Doc opened, and we're working on my work plan together. And I'm able to actually see what she is talking about, and she's able to also see what I'm talking about. And we can also make edits at the same time to the plan. And how this would have gone previously is I would have been in my supervisor's office, and she would have been the only one who had access to the plan, and I would have been having to basically only listen. Another example is earlier this year, I did a workshop for my coworkers on it was on basically explaining about website accessibility, and I did a demonstration of how a screen reader accesses a website. And through that presentation, I was able to share my screen and visually demonstrate what I was doing for my coworkers. And I was also able to even explain points of HTML code, like what it is to have a proper heading tag or a proper link tag, by opening a notepad and typing out examples. And then I was even able to indicate the example by highlighting it. And this, for me, normally I would have to have somebody else assist me to write something on the board, for example, and we probably would have needed to do a little bit of extra work to plug in a projector. Having this presentation done virtually pretty much eliminated all of that friction. You can also access a wider range of people. And I think you can all kind of see what I'm talking about right now. There's probably a variety of countries represented here. And of course, you probably had your own experiences as well. So let me tell you about some of ours, though. For example, Mobility International USA has what we call our Women's Institute on Leadership and Disability. It's a program that brings disability rights leaders, women, also with disabilities, from all parts of the world, especially from low-income and developing countries. They come to Eugene, and they, over a couple weeks, they learn about disability culture, community organizing, applying for grants, professional development, and all in all, WILD outfits these individuals with the tools to go back to their communities, set up their own organizations, and make a difference. And earlier this year, we were able to get a selection, about 30 or 40 individuals from our more than 2,300 alumni worldwide, onto a Zoom meeting where we were able to check in about what was going on in their communities vis-a-vis the pandemic. And they were able to learn from each other about effective ways of responding to the pandemic as a result. Another example was our Joining Hands Symposium on Disability and Exchange, which was organized by the NCDE, and which also was over 2 weeks. It organized workshops on disability and international exchange. There was a panel on how to organize accessible virtual exchanges. There was there were discussions about accessibility in specific countries. Like, we had a speaker from Argentina talking about his country. We had a Peace Corps alumnus with cerebral palsy talking about what it was like for her volunteering in Jamaica. And overall, in that symposium, we had representatives from almost 70 countries. It included audience members and presenters. Another key thing that we have noticed right away about international exchange, virtual exchange, is increased mobility. And I'm going to talk about, I think that there's a serious increased potential for mobility. And I'll tell you a couple stories that make me draw this conclusion. First of all, as part of my job, I take questions from people from around the world about disability and international exchange, and I answer questions from individuals looking to study abroad as well as professionals. And many of the individuals are also international students who want to come to the United States. And actually, before the symposium, Patrick and I were talking about how when an American studies abroad, they do it at most for maybe 6 months to a year. And it's really kind of more of like a super internship, sort of a career development, something to do for fun, for adventure, for a challenge, and put it on their resume. Whereas when somebody from Mexico or Kenya studies abroad, they do so to actually get an education, to build their career, and to actually earn a degree. And I actually heard, but there's a couple things that money, of course, is a barrier to this. Also, access to English is a barrier to this as well. And a while back, I was contacted by a deaf woman from Mexico who wanted to come and study in the United States. But to start, she had to also learn English and American Sign Language in order to be able to make the cut and pass the TOEFL requirement. And one of the issues is that while there's a lot of funding for master's degrees in the United States, at least comparatively more funding than there is for other opportunities, there's almost no funding for people to take intensive English courses, and probably even much less for people to take intensive American Sign Language courses. As a result, I was able to share some online study resources for this individual, but I think that someone like her would have been able to benefit from a greater offering of online virtual English and, if possible, even American Sign Language coursework. Another example was a woman who had kidney disease from South Africa, and she was contacting me because I think she was even actually in the process of applying to colleges, a very qualified person, very articulate, and she had one setback though, which is that she needed to have dialysis regularly in order to take care of her kidney. And unfortunately, I was not able to, the more research I did with that to advise her, the more it seemed to me that it was going to be hard for her to be able to pay for those costs coming to the United States. And actually, often we find there have been other instances that I can recall where people with disabilities, especially chronic health conditions, find it difficult to come to other countries where they don't have the level of healthcare support and arranged already. Now, we've already seen, too, a variety of examples of virtual programs, including virtual programs that are already thinking a lot about including people with disabilities. One of those is the National Security Language Initiative for Youth, or Nestle Y Virtual, which is a program funded by the U.S. Department of State. And the idea is, many of you might already know about it, but it's a program in which young adults can study a foreign language that is deemed as strategically important by the United States government. So there's a variety of opportunities to study Russian, Chinese, Japanese, and more. And all you need is basically just an interest in the language. And Nestle Y Virtual is a program that takes place over 10 weeks. And there's about 2 or 3 class meetings per week. There's also asynchronous work where students do homework assignments, and they also complete collaborative assignments and forum-based assignments where they share ideas with their peers. And at the end, they get a certificate of completion, and they also become eligible for they also still continue to be eligible for the in-person program as well when that becomes available. And we actually had some presenters from that program at our symposium, and they gave a very excellent presentation about sort of the techniques that they've been using to ensure access. I'll be talking about those briefly, but I'm not going to go into as much detail about the specific mechanical details of accessibility. But I would encourage you to take a look at the highlights of Joining Hands and also sign up to our newsletter. You can also go to the MIUSA booth in the exhibits hall, in the expo hall here. And if you just click contact NCDE at MIUSA, I will follow up with you. Another example that we observed was at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. The University of Nebraska at Lincoln has organized what they call their Cultural Professional Virtual Exchange Program. And essentially it's a project for entrepreneurs from Egypt, and they take coursework online. They also have regular meetings, weekly meetings with student organizations in Lincoln, entrepreneurial organizations and community organizations in Lincoln as well. And that virtual component is going to be complemented, hopefully, by an in-person component in the spring, where they're going to, if circumstances permitting, they're going to come into Lincoln, Nebraska in the spring and engage in a sort of competition. They're going to come up with an entrepreneurial idea, and they're going to engage in a competition with others to pitch their idea and see who gives the better promotion. Now, I'll just kind of briefly mention about some of the accessibility difficulties that we've encountered. I've talked about the opportunities and just the inherent benefits of virtual environments. And I'm going to just consider some of the things that you should keep in mind to make sure that accessibility and those benefits can actually be reaped. And so first area that we've encountered difficulty with is in including blind people or people who are blind. And I've actually experienced it personally, so I'm experiencing it now. Hopin is a usable platform, but it's got its shortcomings. So accessibility things to keep in mind for blind and visually impaired users are, there's a list here. First of all, it's important to make sure that you use an accessible platform from the beginning. And I'll hand it to Hopin. It's actually pretty usable. A couple other platform that we've been using at work is Zoom. And you can kind of recognize, I think, an accessible platform when they have a disability page. For example, if you search about accessibility and Zoom, they actually have an online resource where they actually talk about the steps they take to ensure accessibility. And they also have a contact address that you can reach out to them with to share accessibility concerns. Another issue is with disseminating accessible documents. The most common thing that we've observed is when somebody scans a reading into a PDF file. They think it's a PDF, they upload it, and they say, I've got a reading for all of you. Well, actually, it's not a PDF, it's an image that's masquerading as a PDF. It might as well just be a PNG file. And you can tell because if you can't highlight it, if you try to highlight it, you can't actually, you can't do that. You can't highlight it. You can't search it. That's another way to test, is by pressing Control F and searching for text that you see within the file. And you'll see that you actually can't find it. So making sure to generate accessible PDF documents, and also to have RTF or Microsoft Word version of the document available as an alternative. And so we have some great resources online that explain about how you'd go about doing that. And finally, when presenters are showing images or graphic detail and they're not describing it, or when they're using presentations with poor contrast. For example, people who have vision but who have trouble perceiving color contrasts can find difficulties with presentations that don't use really strong color contrasts. Another group that we are trying to make sure is better supported is deaf and hard of hearing people. And the most common challenge with deaf and hard of hearing people is ensuring communication access, making sure that if somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing is on this talk, that they can hear what I'm saying. And you can actually see the captions that are here that we actually have on this presentation, and those are originally designed for somebody who is hard of hearing or deaf, so that they can follow along with the discussion. And they also serve double duty for people for whom English is a second language. Another area has to do with sign language interpreters. There are some deaf people who prefer sign language interpreters because it's their preference. In other cases, there are deaf people, especially in international environments, who might not have the same level of understanding of written language. So oftentimes, for example, at Mobility International, we have deaf people from other countries who maybe they know their local sign language, but they're not as strong when it comes to written English. So we will actually have both American Sign Language interpreters and international sign language interpreters on those calls to facilitate access. Now, what's really important, though, is, and I think the thing that's really if you're kind of wondering to yourself how you're going to, what you would do right now, if you're just kind of looking for some actionable steps to take apart from the ones I've shared, and you want to be more flexible, it's important that you have a way through which participants can request accommodations. So whenever we organize an event or program, we always, on our registration form, have a spot for prospective participants to request an accommodation. Yeah, so I think that's the main thing. So now I'm going to go on to talking more as well about after the pandemic, right? I think we hope that the pandemic is going to come to an end. I think it eventually will come to an end. And so we think one of the things that we want you to take the chance to do right now that maybe some of you might be hopefully experiencing a break from some of the minutiae of daily in-person programming concerns, is to stop and think about how can you design your programs from the beginning to be more accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities. And now I'm talking about in-person programs as a contrast to virtual exchange programs. And at Mobility International USA, we're strong advocates of applying what we call universal design principles to international exchange. And a common rebuttal I hear with that is people will say, well, you can't have universal design because there aren't any curb cuts in Mexico City or in many other countries. And so, that's pretty much a moot point right there. Well, there also aren't really curb cuts in many places in the United States either. So it's not really about whether you have a certain kind of accessibility implemented right away. It's more about a mindset. It's about approaching the design process of a program right from the beginning and thinking right away in terms of what is somebody who can't hear this or who can't see this or who has limited ability to walk, how are they going to benefit from this program that we're organizing? And so very briefly, what I'll share some examples. Let's start with housing. Consider, for example, is there a housing situation where a student can have their own distraction-free workspace? People with learning disabilities, Tourette syndrome require this. What about, is there a housing situation with an accessible entrance for a student who uses a manual wheelchair? What about an accessible entrance for a student using a power wheelchair? Is there a housing situation that has a roll-in shower? And it's important to think about these specific features because not every wheelchair user is going to need a roll-in shower. So it's about starting by considering and planning for how can you make sure that there's a housing situation that would meet these requirements if a student were to request them. Another area is transportation. And this especially applies when it comes to group outings. For example, if you work with a tour bus operator, do they have a bus that has space for a power wheelchair user in the back, or will in any part of the bus? Do they have a way for somebody to be loaded on to the bus? Many buses, for example, should have a lift, a hydraulic lift. And also, I think too, do you have any idea about, can you advise somebody who's going to go out on their own, how they might get around your country if the public transit is not fully accessible? For example, we knew of an office a while back that was able to advise a wheelchair user on getting around in Mexico City. And basically what they were able to find for her was that she could use taxis to get around, as a contrast to walking around or using public transit. And yes, it is okay to say walking when you're talking about a wheelchair user. That's another language thing. Another important area is healthcare. So I told you about the woman with kidney disease from South Africa. And it's important, one of the biggest challenges that I would say that that we encounter in advising people with disabilities, and I think one of the biggest challenges with inclusion is when it comes to insurance. Many plans do not include coverage for pre-existing conditions. And so it's important to check and see, does your plan have coverage? And if not, is there the option to purchase a waiver? So that way, if somebody with a pre-existing condition requiring coverage were to join your program, would they be able to purchase the extra coverage? And finally,
Justin, it is 6:35.
Great. Okay. So finally, just kind of the last couple points here are access surveys. So we think that every couple years, you're probably wondering how you're going to learn all this stuff. Well, every couple years, what you should be doing is what we call an access survey or an access audit, where you team up with disability rights organizations, your partners, and you survey around the communities, the host communities, and you ask those kinds of questions. And you do research and you gather the information. And then you make the information available on your online resources alongside the other details about your program, so prospective disabled participants can educate themselves about how they will be able to be successful in your program. Finally, as I mentioned before, just having a procedure to request reasonable accommodations. So that way, even if you didn't foresee everything, that's okay. but just making sure that somebody has the ability to let you know if there's something that you're missing with a sufficient time for you to respond. And now, very briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about openness. So as I've mentioned, we have encountered, at least I'll just speak for the United States, we have encountered kind of a sense of reluctance, it seems like, to welcome international students. Before the pandemic even started, there was a campaign on the part of the international education community. I don't know if you all remember #YouAreWelcomeHere. The idea was that there was a lot of talk about closing access for international students or making it harder for them to benefit from studying in the United States. And it seems like the pandemic has only added to that motivation. And what I want to leave you with is that how talking about people with disabilities can help us to strengthen our advocacy for greater openness. And so what I'll briefly share with you in some food for thought is that people with disabilities around the world experience a lack of access, not only due to first structural barriers, policy barriers. It also includes bias against welcoming people with disabilities into workspaces or schools. And this can, and for example, let me tell you a story about a deaf man named Inocencio, who is from Mozambique. And Inocencio is totally deaf, and he surveyed around, he was trying to get a degree, his bachelor's degree, and he was surveying schools in Mozambique, and they all told him that they couldn't teach somebody like him. And so as a result, he had to go outside to get his undergraduate degree, which he earned in South Africa. And then he earned his master's degree in education in the United States. And he's now back in his country, Mozambique, enhancing education for the deaf so that other people like him can have more opportunities. Another key thing to think about is that disability and poverty go hand in hand. You can imagine if somebody can't get a job, they can't earn money, they can't, and sometimes people with disabilities have dependents. So children and parents and relatives can also come into play as far as the person's ability to support them. Disability can also take other relatives out of work as they have to support a person with a disability at home if they're not adequately supported by community services. And also disability in itself is more expensive. It's more expensive to pay a driver, for example, to get around, or it's more expensive to pay for a van with a lift. Those are some examples of things we encounter in the United States. And studying in a country like the United States is an opportunity for a person with a disability to get out of poverty and to create opportunities for themselves. A while back, we met a woman named Flavia, a blind woman from Ethiopia who wanted to earn a master's degree in the United States. And she was very fortunate. I don't know if you all remember the Ford Fellowship, but Flavia was one of the lucky winners of that fellowship. She was able to come to the United States, to the University of Texas at Austin, and she spent 2 years earning her master's degree in education. She came back home and saw an opportunity to go get a faculty position at a local university in Ethiopia. Her interviewer asked her, "How are you going to get to work?" The interviewer seemed very skeptical that this blind woman would be able to even get to the office, much less do her job. And she was able to respond, "Well, if I went to the United States to get my degree, I'm sure that I can get to work just fine." Her degree in the United States was, I think, as we listen to her story, a key pivotal factor that helped her to get that faculty job at the university in Ethiopia, a job which probably up to that point other blind people hadn't been able to get. So we now have somebody who, as a result of earning a degree in the United States, somebody who is now in a prestigious job that they would have never had access to before, and they're able to support their family. Their money is going back into their community, and they're also potentially in the process of opening up similar opportunities for other people like them. So I think that these stories tell us a story about how it's not just about rich students coming to get a fancy degree and go back home and get even richer, or maybe stay in the country and get a fancy job in the United States, for example. That they're certainly welcome to do that if they want to. It's also about people who, in the case of Inocencio, who would otherwise have no choice, no other place to go, and for whom a degree in the United States or in South Africa might be the only option. And it's also about people like Flavia, for whom new career horizons can be opened up by degree and I think that this is an example of how we can, as a whole, reduce poverty by creating more opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have them. So those are the kind of the ends of my remarks, and I'll let Patrick funnel some of your questions through to me.
Thanks so much, Justin. Amazing information. I'm just going to kind of take it a little bit in order. Doug Waxman, Waxman, was one of the earlier questions, just said more resources and advice supporting teachers traveling worldwide. Anything quickly to say about that? You mentioned a lot already.
Resources and advice for teachers traveling worldwide, like teachers with disabilities.
They're English teachers. That's what they do.
Yeah.
Doug, I don't know if you, yep, go ahead.
So I think that for us, I think I would encourage people who have questions about teaching English to reach out to clearinghouse at MIUSA.org. And we have responded to a small handful of inquiries. There's also a lot of, I think, helpful posts online about teaching students with different kinds of disabilities. And I think that's what the question is about. And what I think, though, for a teacher of languages is coming from speaking as somebody who's studied Spanish and Portuguese, I think the important thing is just to stay open and to listen to the student and ask the student what they need to be successful. I have been taught by probably over 10 Spanish teachers. I was taught by a couple different Portuguese teachers, and I don't think a single one of them had any special knowledge about how to teach blind people. 4 of my Spanish teachers were in Mexico, in Morelia, and I'm pretty sure they didn't have any experience teaching blind students. But the thing they all had in common was that they were open, and they were open to my suggestions, and they were welcoming. And as a result, I think that I was able to learn Spanish, and I think they might have even taken some useful skills on teaching blind people as well.
Thanks, Justin. Amy Bars from World Oregon asks for any thoughts on virtual exchange and accessibility, and you've touched on this, of course, but specifically she asks, we have used closed captioning on Zoom and have an upcoming exchange that will use interpretation, and she's eager to hear any other best practices when setting up virtual exchange.
So yeah, at our Joining Hands symposium, just speaking, it sounds like in terms of deaf/hard of hearing accommodations, we offered American Sign Language and captions /CART. And what I would point out is that we are a disability organization, and it just wouldn't look good for us to have a symposium which is not signed and captioned. But the thing is, most people can access captions, we find, and not as many can access sign language, American Sign Language. And so if you're thinking about a default thing should be the captions. And then you should think about if somebody asks for interpreters, you should be ready to call them up. We usually encourage people to give us a week in advance to ask for interpreters. Although we actually were recently advised by one communications company that they're actually requiring up to 2 weeks. So you can actually request that in your registration form. We require 1 or 2 weeks of notice. After that, we can't guarantee accommodations. That's perfectly acceptable. And when it comes to captions, there are automated options out there, options where you can have a computer transcribe what is being said. As a user of Drag and Dictate software, I can tell you that even the best speech-to-text technology in the world is not quite so accurate. It might seem to you that it's 85% accurate, and 85% is not what it really needs to be, which is 95%, 99%. And so you get that higher level of accuracy with a human. Now, sometimes if you're planning last minute, you can also think about having somebody from a temp agency type. We've had that before, and they can, for example, type in a Google document. You have to speak. You might have to delay or wait for the person to catch up. Captioners are using special equipment to keep up with speech. And another thing you can think about is if you have a recording of a session that maybe nobody asked for captions and nobody asked for sign language, what you can do is have somebody from a temp agency use the automated feature like the YouTube transcription, and then the person goes through it and corrects the errors. And that can also be a solution for creating access to a recorded resource.
Santiago identifies themselves as an identity first person and asks, Justin, do you want to touch on the medical model of disability versus cultural model, only so far as it relates to person first language versus identity first language?
Sure. That actually is one thing that was on my outline, and I intentionally skipped it just because of the outage. I wasn't sure how much time I was going to have. So, the way that MIUSA thinks of disability is from a cultural / I'll call it social perspective. And basically the way that we think about it is the world at large tends to think about disability from a medical model, or that is to say, the problem originates with the person. And so the solution is the person needs to be fixed, either by fixing themselves, by improving their attitude, by learning to crawl upstairs, by learning to reprint, for example. I don't know. Or by getting a cure, right? Somebody else needs to fix them. And the social model says that the problem is not with the person, it's with the society. And so an example that you often hear that I think is helpful is if a group of colleagues, including one who uses a wheelchair, decide to have a meeting, if all the other colleagues decide to have the meeting on the second floor of a building without an elevator, then the other person who uses the wheelchair is disabled because of the fact that they can't get upstairs. But they're not disabled by their impairment, which could be a spinal cord injury. They're disabled by the way that the environment in the meeting has been structured and planned.
Thank you. The next question came from Santiago as well. How do screen readers do with multilingual content on the same HTML page?
Well, today HTML pages have a variety of information embedded in the code, and some of that information embedded in the code has to do with the language that is being used, and different web page designers will correctly or incorrectly use this code. But basically, it will, if your screen reader is set to do this, the code will alert your screen reader the language that's being used. And if you have a synthesizer installed on your computer that speaks that language, then the screen reader will automatically call up that synthesizer and pronounce it.
There was a little back and forth about the question of whether Braille for Spanish is different from Braille for English.
It is. Yeah. So Braille for Spanish, the punctuations are different. English Braille has about 181 shorthand symbols, what we call grade 2 Braille, which is to say shorthand. You can write one symbol to express ER, CAN, OUT, OUGHT. There are single or double symbols that can express 4 or 5 or 6 letters. In Spanish, there is a sort of a stenographical shorthand, and it's not mainstream. In Braille and English, you can't read unless you know the 181 or so symbols of stenography. And in Spanish, however, all pretty much mainstream Spanish texts in Braille are written out fully. And also, the other thing is Spanish has accented letters, ñes, and the occasional umlaut. I forgot that there's another word for it, though, in Spanish. And those are also their own symbols.
Rachel Anderholder asks, are virtual exchange programs more affordable than traditional exchange programs? I think she means generally speaking.
I would guess that they are, but I haven't really had a chance to do direct price comparisons. I'm not inclined to jump right away into saying that they are cheaper, because I know of some universities that are continuing to charge in-person tuition even though they're offering virtual classes. I guess I would say there's certainly an opportunity to make them more affordable, though.
And Doug from International TEFL Academy, Doug Waxman, asks, are there any major online platforms for learning English that do a good job of catering to people with disabilities?
That is a good question. There aren't any that come to mind right now, and that's not because there aren't any good ones necessarily. It's because I haven't had a chance to take a look at them. Um, yeah, I think that, though, a while back I took this up because I was trying to study Arabic, and I kind of just found, and I've also explored some Spanish language sites as well, and I feel like I've just kind of found that each site sort of has the things it does well and the things it kind of doesn't do so well. I actually had a blind friend a while back who was studying German, and I can't for the life of me remember what program he was referring to, but he actually had encountered a website that was actually really responsive to him. Like, he would bring issues to their attention, and I guess they would actually fix them, which is a huge value. It's like what makes Zoom so great, because they're so responsive. But what I would encourage you to do is, if there's any local blindness organizations in your country, to check with them if there's any sort of online tools they use. Another thing you can do is the National Federation of the Blind is an American consumer organization of blind people. They have the National Association of Blind Students, NABS. NABS has a mail listserv that you can enroll on, and you can maybe survey that listserv to see what blind students today have found to be useful in the area of websites for studying languages.
The last main question we have is from Wendy Maruvia, M-E-R-U-V-I-A, one of the coordinators of the conference. In Bolivia, social inclusion for people with disabilities is very, very low, especially for professional and work opportunities. If we would like to help those people first learn English so they can have the chance to study abroad, is there any type of support, technical or financial, we could access? And she continues right after that. Plus, does MIUSA help students or professionals with disabilities get matched at a school or with an employee?
Ooh. I would love to say that we do matching, but we do not have those resources to do matching. NCDE is strictly an informational entity, so we're strictly focused on information dissemination. And your question about, are there financial resources to teach people with disabilities language, English? Yeah, I feel like most of those would probably be scholarships for people. So, and there aren't any suggestions that come to mind for me right now. I guess what I would ask is, what kinds of resources are there for other low-income folks to access English education in countries like Bolivia? And I can share, though, that if people with disabilities can enroll in schools that will work with them, they can usually learn. I actually knew a blind woman again, who blind people often have a lot of the trouble with English, blind and deaf people. I know a blind woman who she's very good at English. She does a lot of international disability rights work. Her name is Rosario. And Rosario, years ago, learned English, and she did it by going to English schools in Lima. So she did not access a fancy international program. She just went to one of the schools that was available to her as a Peruvian. And she probably might have had to ask around. I can't exactly remember the specific details. I remember, though, this was in the early 2000s, maybe I think some courses she took in the late 1990s. And she had help from family members to read content for her and to write, I think. And she had like access to a fraction of the technological resources that blind people have access to today, even in countries like Peru. So I think that if a blind person or a deaf person enrolls in an English school in Bolivia or Peru or wherever, I don't think it should cost extra per se to teach them.
There is one other question from earlier. Santiago asks, do universities not accept ASL monolinguals?
No. In the United States, no. That's actually a good question. We get that occasionally, and no, they do not. If you think about it, colleges, universities, you have to turn in your papers in English. There's not really a written form of ASL. So when you get an assignment to write out a paper or an essay, or to go online and collaborate with your classmates and fill out a question on a forum, for example, an online discussion, you have to be able to use English. And even when you look at a university like Gallaudet University, is a university where all the classes are done in ASL, and even at Gallaudet University, you're expected to have English proficiency. So, and when you're talking about English proficiency for deaf people, an important allowance is that if you're completely deaf, then you just probably aren't going to handle the oral part of English unless maybe you had some hearing earlier in your life, or you have a cochlear implant. You're just probably, verbal oral English might not be something that you're just going to do. And the people who hold the TOEFL exams and the IELTS understand that, and colleges in the United States understand that. And so there is allowance for somebody to sit out the oral portions of those exams as long as they can pass in written English. So yes, it is a requirement, though.
Thanks, Justin. We have just 3 minutes remaining, so a little bit of a direction to what's happening next. And then if folks don't mind, I have a bit of a question for you. So right after this, we will light up our networking area. So if you want to debrief and talk with other people, just jump in there and it'll randomly connect you with other people in the program for about 3 minutes, and you'll keep getting matched to people until you get tired of it. Also, Justin, will you be around a little bit? Will you be able to be in your booth or participate in the networking for a little bit?
Yeah, I can go. I can go hang out in my booth.
Okay. So if you want to ask Justin some more questions, head over to Expo, click on Expo when we're done, and then find the MIUSA or Mobility International booth, and he'll be in there and you can ask him some questions for a little bit. My question was just a word or two about your own process. Habla muy bien español. How did that, how most people think of, you read a book, you do some exercises, and that's how you do it. How did it work for you?
I just thought about it learning like a kid. I had some formal instruction. So, I mean, that is one advantage. I had 4 years in high school, which was kind of limited. And I had, I think I had in college, Spanish 2 and 3, I believe. And then what I did was I basically set myself to learning independently, and I would use a screen reader to access online journal articles, and I would read in Spanish, and I would have to translate 5 or 6 words every paragraph. I think I also didn't really spend a lot of time worrying that I couldn't understand things. That's a common thing I hear about people learning a language. They complain to me that they can't understand, so they don't watch movies or teleseries or anything like that. And of course, for me, I couldn't. I watched 2 teleseries. I watched, I don't know if any of you remember Betty La Fea, but I watched that. And I watched Juana la Virgen. And back in the day, you could watch anything on YouTube, but they did not have subtitles. If they did, I couldn't have read them anyway. So I just basically would sit there and watch and just sort of try to follow what was kind of going on using what I could see on the screen and what was happening audibly. And then if I heard a word, I would just basically bring it up in word reference and see if I could type it out, first of all. And then if I could, I'd see what came up, and kind of bit by bit, I just started to kind of learn. And, when you just learn, like I knew a blind guy from originally from Yemen, and he migrated to Saudi Arabia. And he basically taught himself English. And as a teenager, he basically started listening to things like the BBC. He started going online and studying. Basically, within about a year, he pretty much had obtained fluency in English. And within about 4 or 5 years, he was able to qualify to study in the United States. And he's now completing his bachelor's degree in the United States from a university in Utah. And I asked him, because now he's English, and you'd never know that he had basically no formal instruction. He basically literally taught himself. And I asked him how in the world he did it. And he said, when you're Justin, I was 17 years old. I had nothing in front of me. I was basically looking at a life of idleness. I'm totally paraphrasing this. There was nothing in front of me. I felt like I wasn't going to have anything, to motivate me. And so there was no other choice. I just did it because I had no other choice. And so, I think that's something to keep in mind is, when a blind or deaf person, or another person with a disability comes to an English school, for example, to learn English, I think you can expect that they could be quite a lot more motivated than you'd expect.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Justin. Give us some virtual claps out there. I mean, I know we'd be hearing the clapping. Doug and Wendy both thank you for your answers. And if you want to chat with Justin, we're going to head right over into the expo booth, and we'll see you over there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.